Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're venturing into one of Africa's most extraordinary stories. We're heading to Kenya, a country that somehow managed to cram the entire continent's worth of drama, beauty and surprises into a single nation. From snow-capped mountains sitting directly on the equator to coral reefs teeming with life, from ancient human fossils to cutting-edge mobile banking that left Silicon Valley scratching their heads, Kenya is the kind of place that makes geography textbooks seem boring by comparison. Tonight, we'll uncover how this remarkable land became home to humanity's earliest ancestors, witness the rise of Swahili trading empires, survived the colonial scramble for Africa, and emerged as the continent's unexpected technology powerhouse, all while maintaining some of the world's most spectacular wildlife and warmest people. This is a story spanning millions of years, but don't worry, we'll take it nice and slow. If you're new here and enjoy learning history the relaxing way, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, your late-night curiosity will thank you later. So wherever you are in the world tonight, get comfortable and let's explore the incredible journey of Kenya. Chapter 1: Ancient Kenya and Early Civilizations. Kenya sits like nature's own archaeological treasure chest in East Africa, bordered by Ethiopia to the north, Somalia to the east, Tanzania to the south, and Uganda to the west. The Indian Ocean laps against its eastern shores, providing what must be one of the most pleasant commutes to work if you happen to be an ancient trader. But long before anyone was thinking about trade routes or national borders, Kenya was busy being the backdrop for one of evolution's greatest success stories, the rise of humanity itself. Picture, if you will, the year 4 million BCE. There were no humans as we know them, no cities, no roads, and certainly no one complaining about traffic. Instead, the landscapes of Kenya were populated by our distant relatives, who were taking their first tentative steps toward becoming something remarkable. The region around Lake Turkana, in particular, was practically a prehistoric campus for early human development. Though unlike modern universities, tuition was free and the only required reading involved figuring out which end of a stick worked best for digging. In the year 2000, Martin Pickford and Brigitte Senut made a discovery in the Tugan Hills that would shake the anthropological world, or at least make it wobble slightly with excitement. They uncovered fragments of what they named Orrorin tuganensis, dating back approximately 6 million years. The name Orrorin means original man in the local Tugan language, which shows remarkable prescience considering they had no way of knowing they were naming what might be humanity's earliest ancestor. It's rather like accidentally giving your pet goldfish a name that means future overlord and then watching it evolve legs. About 20 million years ago, primates had already established themselves across the region, living lives that probably involved significantly less existential dread than their human descendants would experience. The landscape was different then, lusher, with vast forests and lakes that would make today's climate change activists weep with both joy and sorrow. It was, by all accounts, rather like a prehistoric Eden, assuming Eden came with the occasional saber-toothed predator and absolutely no customer service. In 1929, Louis Leakey, a man whose name would become synonymous with groundbreaking discoveries and presumably excellent dinner party conversations, unearthed 1 million-year-old Acheulean hand axes at the Kariandusi prehistoric site. These weren't your modern Swiss Army knives, but they represented a revolutionary leap in human technology. Imagine the excitement of the first early human who discovered that a shaped stone could do more than just sit there looking rocky. It was probably the prehistoric equivalent of inventing the internet, though with considerably less cat videos. The site of Ulorgesailie, about 70 kilometres south of modern-day Nairobi, became what archaeologists fondly call the factory of stone tools. This wasn't actually a factory in any sense we'd recognise. There were no assembly lines, lunch breaks, or union representatives. Instead, it was a place where early humans consistently came to craft their implements, leaving behind such an abundance of tools that archaeologists centuries later would struggle to count them all. Around 3.2 million years ago, near Lake Turkana, ancient toolmakers created what are now recognised as the oldest stone tools found anywhere in the world. These tools predated the emergence of our direct ancestors, suggesting that the neighbourhood was already intellectually busy long before Homo sapiens decided to join the party. The tools were crude by modern standards. You couldn't exactly use them to assemble IKEA furniture, but they represented the first conscious manipulation of the environment for specific purposes. In essence, they were humanity's first homework assignment, and thankfully no one had to worry about spelling. In 1984, near Lake Turkana, paleoanthropologist Richard Leakey, assisted by Kamoya Kimeu, discovered what would become known as Turkana Boy, a nearly complete skeleton of Homo erectus dating back 1.6 million years. The skeleton belonged to a boy estimated to be between 9 and 12 years old when he died, but he was already over 1.6 meters tall. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of early human physiology, revealing that our ancestors were surprisingly tall and gangly long before basketball was invented to give them something useful to do with all that height. Unlike earlier hominids who were thought to be no taller than chimpanzees, Turkana Boy showed that our ancestors had developed long legs adapted for walking and running over long distances. His brain, however, was still considerably smaller than that of modern humans, suggesting he probably wouldn't have enjoyed crossword puzzles but would have been excellent at prehistoric marathons. The shores of Lake Turkana proved to be something of a treasure trove for fossil hunters. The region yielded numerous specimens that painted an increasingly detailed picture of human evolution. Kubifora, on the eastern shores of the lake, became particularly famous for its extensive paleontological finds, beginning in 1969 with the discovery of Paranthropus boisei, a robust cousin species that chose a different evolutionary path involving massive jaw muscles and a diet that would have made modern dentists very wealthy. In 2018, archaeologists working at Ulorgesailie made discoveries that would fundamentally change our understanding of early human behaviour. They found evidence of complex behaviours from around 320,000 years ago, including long-distance trade networks involving goods such as obsidian, the use of pigments, and possibly the making of projectile points. Essentially, our ancestors were networking and decorating long before LinkedIn and Pinterest made it trendy. Perhaps one of the most touching discoveries came in 2021 at Panga Yasaidi Cave, where researchers found evidence of Africa's earliest known funeral. A 78,000-year-old grave contained the remains of a 3-year-old child whose head appeared to have been laid on a pillow with the body positioned in a fetal pose. This discovery provided profound insight into early human cognition and sociality, proving that our ancestors had developed concepts of care, mourning, and ritual that would be entirely familiar to us today. The discovery at Panga Yasaidi demonstrated that early humans had developed sophisticated concepts of death, memory, and community. The careful positioning of the child's body wasn't accidental. It required planning, emotional investment, and a shared understanding among the community about appropriate treatment of the dead. Our ancestors had developed empathy and social bonds that transcended mere survival, creating the foundation for the complex societies that would eventually emerge. This 78,000-year-old burial represents a pivotal moment in human development, When our species began to demonstrate behaviors that we would recognize as fundamentally human, the capacity for grief, remembrance, and ritual care for the departed. As we move beyond these prehistoric foundations, it becomes clear that Kenya was never a quiet backwater in human development. Instead, it served as humanity's testing ground, where our ancestors experimented with tools, social structures, and ways of understanding their world. The Rift Valley became a natural laboratory for human evolution, its unique geological features preserving evidence of our species' long journey from tree-dwelling primates to tool-making, art-creating, burial-practicing humans. The geological conditions of the Rift Valley played a crucial role in both human evolution and the preservation of evidence we study today. Volcanic activity provided layers of ash that acted like nature's filing system, carefully separating and dating different periods of human habitation. It's rather like having a very thorough prehistoric librarian who happened to specialize in cataloguing human remains, though with somewhat more explosive methods than modern library science would recommend. By around 2000 BCE, Kenya began experiencing waves of migration that would shape its demographic and cultural landscape for millennia to come. The first of these major migrations involved Cushitic-speaking peoples from northern Africa, who moved into present-day Kenya, bringing with them new technologies, agricultural practices, and social structures. They brought knowledge of animal husbandry that was particularly well suited to the arid and semi-arid regions they settled. These Cushitic migrants weren't tourists on a brief visit. They came to stay, establishing communities that would thrive in Kenya's northern and eastern regions for thousands of years. Their arrival marked the beginning of Kenya's transformation from a land primarily inhabited by hunter-gatherers to one supporting more complex settled societies. Around the first few centuries of the Common Era, a new wave of migrants began arriving along Kenya's coast and gradually moving inland. These were Bantu-speaking peoples, originating from West Africa along the Benue River in what is now eastern Nigeria and western Cameroon. The Bantu migration was one of the most significant demographic movements in African history, comparable to the more famous migrations in European history, though with considerably less written documentation and far more linguistic diversity. The Bantu brought revolutionary technologies that would transform Kenya's landscape and society. They were skilled in iron smelting, pottery making, and advanced agricultural techniques that could support larger, more stable populations. Their arrival wasn't a sudden invasion, it was more like a very slow wave, with communities gradually establishing themselves, intermarrying with existing populations, and sharing knowledge. Think of it as prehistory's version of a cultural exchange program, except it lasted several centuries and nobody kept track of the paperwork. Archaeological evidence shows that by 100 BCE to 300 CE, Bantu-speaking communities were well established along Kenya's coastal areas, particularly around Kwale and other locations that would later become important trading centres. These early Bantu settlers integrated and intermarried with the communities already present on the coast, creating the cultural foundations for what would eventually become the Swahili civilization. The Bantu settlers introduced new ways of thinking about land use, community organisation and social structure. Their agricultural systems allowed for food surpluses, which enabled some community members to specialise in crafts, trade, and other non-agricultural pursuits. This specialisation marked the beginning of more complex social hierarchies and economic systems in Kenya. Essentially, they invented the concept of having a job that didn't directly involve finding your next meal, which was quite revolutionary for its time. Between the 10th and 14th centuries, a third major group of migrants arrived in Kenya, Nilotic-speaking peoples from the region that is now Sudan. These groups moved south and west, establishing themselves in the Great Rift Valley and the areas around Lake Victoria. Unlike the Cushitic and Bantu migrants, who were primarily agriculturalists or agropastoralists, many Nilotic groups specialized in pastoralism, developing sophisticated systems for managing cattle, goats, and sheep across Kenya's varied landscapes. The arrival of Nilotic peoples added another layer to Kenya's growing cultural complexity. They brought different concepts of social organization, often based around age-set systems and complex kinship structures. Their pastoralist lifestyle required intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns, grazing areas, and water sources across vast territories. In many ways, they were Kenya's first environmental scientists, though their research methods involved significantly more cattle and considerably fewer peer-reviewed publications. The three major linguistic groups, Cushitic, Bantu, and Nilotic, didn't simply exist in isolation from one another. Instead, they engaged in complex patterns of interaction, trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. These interactions created new hybrid communities and cultural practices that enriched Kenya's social fabric. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities often borrowed technologies, agricultural practices, and social customs from their neighbours, creating a dynamic cultural landscape that was constantly evolving. By the time Arab traders began establishing more permanent settlements along Kenya's coast in the first millennium CE, they encountered not a pristine wilderness, but a land already rich with diverse communities, established trade networks, and sophisticated social systems. The foundation for Kenya's later role as a crossroads of African, Arabian, and eventually European cultures had been laid over millennia by the patient work of countless generations. The ancient history of Kenya reminds us that human civilization didn't spring into existence overnight. It was built slowly, carefully, and collaboratively over millions of years. From Ororintuganensis taking his first upright steps 6 million years ago to the complex multi-ethnic societies that Arab traders encountered in the first millennium CE, Kenya's story is one of gradual progress, adaptation, and the patient accumulation of knowledge. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine the countless generations who called Kenya home long before it had a name, who looked up at the same stars we see today, and who passed down through their children the knowledge and wisdom that would eventually create one of Africa's most dynamic modern nations. Chapter 2: Coastal Trade and Swahili Culture. By the 7th century CE, Kenya's coast was becoming something quite extraordinary. The same monsoon winds that had carried early humans across continents now brought ships laden with goods, ideas, and people who would transform the Kenyan coastline into one of the most sophisticated trading networks in medieval Africa. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to live at the crossroads of 3 continents, the Swahili coast was essentially that intersection, though with considerably more gold and significantly less traffic congestion. The term Swahili comes from the Arabic word sawahil, meaning coasts, which is remarkably straightforward for a civilization that would become famous for its complex cultural fusion. These were truly people of the coasts, but they were also people who understood that being coastal meant being connected to the wider world. The Swahili coast stretched from modern-day Somalia in the north to Mozambique in the south, encompassing the Kenyan ports of Mombasa, Malindi, Lamu, and Pate Island, among others. The foundation of Swahili civilization lay in the earlier Bantu settlements, but from the 8th century onward, something remarkable began happening. Arab-Muslim traders, many fleeing political persecution or seeking better opportunities, started establishing permanent settlements along the coast. Unlike many historical encounters between different peoples, this wasn't primarily a story of conquest or displacement. It was more like a very long, very successful cultural collaboration project, though one that took centuries to complete and involved considerably more intermarriage than modern workplace team-building exercises. These Arab settlers didn't arrive with armies or territorial ambitions. They came with ships, trade goods, and the practical knowledge that prosperity lay in working with local populations rather than against them. The result was gradual integration through intermarriage, conversion to Islam, and the development of new social structures that blended African and Arabian traditions. The local Bantu populations weren't passive recipients of foreign influence. They were active partners in creating something entirely new. By the 9th century, wooden mosques were being built along the coast, with the earliest known examples dating to this period in Kenya. These weren't grand stone structures initially. They were practical buildings that reflected the needs of growing Muslim communities while adapting to local architectural traditions. The fact that they were built of wood rather than stone tells us something important about early Swahili society. It was prosperous enough to support religious architecture, but still flexible and adaptive in its approach to construction. The Indian Ocean trade network that the Swahili coast plugged into was truly remarkable in its scope and sophistication. Ships arrived with the northeast monsoons between November and March, bringing goods from Arabia, Persia, India, and eventually China. They returned with the southwest monsoons between April and October, carrying African products to markets across the known world. This seasonal rhythm became the heartbeat of Swahili life, governing not just trade but social calendars, religious observances, and even marriage arrangements. What made the Swahili coast particularly valuable wasn't just its location but what lay behind it. The African interior was rich in gold, ivory, iron ore, and other precious commodities that were highly prized in distant markets. Gold from the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe reached the coast through established trade routes. Ivory from elephant herds provided luxury materials for carvers across Asia. The coast also exported exotic woods, rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell, and enslaved people. A reminder that not all aspects of this prosperous trade network were benevolent. In exchange, the Swahili coast received finished goods that demonstrated the remarkable reach of medieval global trade. Chinese porcelain arrived in such quantities that fragments still litter archaeological sites today. Indian textiles brought new patterns and weaving techniques that influenced local craft production. Persian carpets and glassware added luxury to elite households. Arabian horses improved local transportation and warfare capabilities. The trade was so extensive that by the 12th century, wealthy Swahili homes contained goods from practically every major civilization in the known world. It was like having a medieval version of global commerce, except delivery times were measured in monsoon seasons rather than days, and customer service involved considerably more haggling and considerably fewer refund policies. The wealth generated by this trade led to the emergence of independent city-states along the coast. Mombasa became known for its excellent natural harbour and strategic location. Malindi developed a reputation for welcoming foreign traders. Lamu became a centre of Islamic scholarship and poetry. Kilwa, further south in modern-day Tanzania, controlled much of the gold trade and became perhaps the wealthiest of all the Swahili cities. These city-states were remarkable for their independence and sophistication. Each was typically ruled by a sultan who governed with the advice of a council of wealthy merchants and religious leaders. The social structure included the ruling elite of mixed African and Arab ancestry, the general population of artisans and traders, and enslaved people who performed manual labour. Despite this hierarchy, the cities were remarkably cosmopolitan places where people of different backgrounds could find opportunities for advancement. A skilled craftsman from India might establish a workshop, an Arab scholar could found a school, or a local African entrepreneur could build a trading empire spanning the ocean. Social mobility, while limited, was possible through commerce, learning, or military service. The Swahili language that emerged during this period is itself a testament to the cultural fusion taking place. Built on a Bantu foundation but incorporating thousands of Arabic loanwords, plus vocabulary from Persian, Portuguese, and other languages, Swahili became the lingua franca of the East African coast. It was a language designed for trade and cultural exchange, with the grammatical flexibility to adapt new concepts and the vocabulary to describe goods from across the known world. Architecture along the Swahili coast evolved to reflect both the growing wealth of the cities and their unique cultural identity. Coral stone, readily available along the coast, was held together with mortar made from lime. The resulting buildings combined practical considerations: thick walls for coolness, flat roofs for water collection, courtyards for privacy, with decorative elements drawn from Islamic, African, and even Indian architectural traditions. Perhaps nowhere was Swahili architectural achievement more impressive than in Kilwa, which by the 14th century boasted one of the largest palaces in sub-Saharan Africa. The Husuni Kubwa Palace complex covered over 2 acres and included a great hall, residential rooms, a swimming pool, and what may have been the first flush toilets in East Africa. The Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who visited Kilwa in 1332, described it as one of the most beautiful towns in the world, which was high praise from someone who had seen most major cities of his era. The prosperity wasn't just material, it was also intellectual and cultural. The cities became centres of Islamic learning, with scholars, poets and theologians contributing to the broader Islamic intellectual tradition. Swahili poetry emerged as a sophisticated art form, often dealing with themes of love, loss and spiritual longing. These weren't provincial backwaters, they were cosmopolitan centres that contributed to global knowledge and culture. The economic foundation of this prosperity was sophisticated and diverse. Beyond the famous gold and ivory trade, the Swahili cities developed local industries that added value to both imported and exported goods. They minted their own coins, beginning as early as the mid-9th century, which shows both their integration into global trade networks and their political independence. The coins bore Arabic inscriptions that reflected the Islamic identity of the ruling classes while serving the practical needs of a complex economy. By the 13th century, the Kilwa Sultanate had emerged as the most powerful of the Swahili city-states, claiming overlordship over much of the coast from modern-day Kenya to Mozambique. Founded in the 10th century by Ali ibn al-Hasan Shirazi, a Persian prince, Kilwa became fabulously wealthy through its control of the gold trade from Sofala. The Kilwa sultans used their gold revenues to build impressive monuments, fund military expeditions, and extend their influence along the coast. The wealth of Kilwa was legendary. When Ibn Battuta visited, he found a city with multi-story stone buildings, glass windows, Ming porcelain, Indian carpets, and a court that maintained luxury that European kingdoms would have envied. The Sultan's palace had over 100 rooms, elaborate gardens, and a throne room that could accommodate hundreds of visitors. This wasn't just prosperity. It was conspicuous prosperity that made visitors from other parts of the world take notice. But the Swahili coast's success contained the seeds of its own transformation. The very wealth and strategic importance that made the cities prosperous also made them targets for those who wanted to control Indian Ocean trade. In 1498, a Portuguese fleet under Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean. Unlike the Arab traders who had integrated gradually into coastal society, the Portuguese came with a different agenda. They wanted to control the trade routes themselves. Francisco de Almeida's expedition in 1505 marked the beginning of systematic Portuguese attempts to control the Swahili coast. Kilwa was sacked and looted, its palace burned, and a puppet sultan installed under Portuguese protection. Mombasa suffered a similar fate, with the city partially destroyed and its wealth carried off in Portuguese ships. The systematic nature of these attacks wasn't accidental. The Portuguese had developed a deliberate strategy of destroying existing trade networks and replacing them with ones they controlled directly. The most visible symbol of Portuguese control was Fort Jesus, built in Mombasa between 1593 and 1596. Designed by the Italian architect Giovanni Battista Cairati, it was one of the most advanced fortifications of its time, designed to withstand cannon fire and control the harbour completely. The fort's layout followed Renaissance principles, with its proportions based on the ideal human form, though its purpose was thoroughly practical, to ensure that no ship could enter or leave Mombasa without Portuguese permission. Portuguese rule was never really successful along the Swahili coast. Their mercantilist policies, which forbade non-Portuguese ships from trading in the major ports, disrupted the established networks that had made the cities prosperous. Local merchants found themselves cut out of the very trade that had made their communities wealthy. The Portuguese lacked the manpower to effectively police the entire coast, and traders simply moved their operations to ports outside Portuguese control. The resistance to Portuguese rule was constant and eventually successful. Fort Jesus changed hands multiple times as local rulers, Ottoman allies, and eventually Omani Arabs fought to expel the Portuguese. The most famous siege occurred from 1696 to 1698, when a coalition of local and Omani forces besieged the fort for over 2 years. When the fort finally fell in 1698, it marked the effective end of Portuguese control over the northern Swahili coast. Despite these challenges, Swahili culture survived and continued to evolve. The language spread inland, becoming the lingua franca for much of East Africa. The architectural traditions continued, influencing building styles throughout the region. Most importantly, the cosmopolitan outlook that had made the Swahili coast prosperous, the ability to adapt, incorporate foreign influences, and maintain cultural identity while engaging with the wider world, remained a defining characteristic of coastal society. The legacy of the medieval Swahili coast extends far beyond Kenya's borders. The trade networks they established connected Africa to global markets in ways that would influence the continent for centuries. The cultural fusion they achieved provided a model for how different societies could interact productively. Most importantly, they showed that prosperity came not from isolation, but from engagement with the wider world. For over 8 centuries, people of different backgrounds found ways to live together profitably and peacefully, pioneering the kind of multicultural, internationally connected society that we often think of as distinctly modern. Chapter 3: Colonial Period and British East Africa. The year 1886 marked the beginning of a new and considerably less collaborative chapter in Kenya's history. While the Swahili coast had been successfully managing international relationships for centuries, the European powers were busy in Berlin, carving up Africa like an overly ambitious dinner party where nobody had consulted the actual inhabitants about who got which slice. Kenya was about to become part of what historians would later call the scramble for Africa, though the actual scrambling would be done almost entirely by people who had never set foot on African soil. Enter William Mackinnon, a Scottish businessman whose shipping company had been trading in the region for years. Encouraged by the British government to establish formal influence in the region, Mackinnon formed the British East Africa Association in 1886. which evolved into the Imperial British East Africa Company in 1888. The company received a royal charter that authorised it to administer the British sphere of influence in East Africa, essentially giving a private corporation the right to run what would become Kenya. It was like outsourcing government to a business, except with considerably more potential for armed conflict and significantly fewer customer service protocols. The Imperial British East Africa Company was granted authority over a coastal strip leased from the Sultan of Zanzibar, plus whatever territory they could effectively control inland. The company's mandate was ambitious: establish trade routes, build infrastructure, maintain peace, collect taxes, and generally transform a diverse collection of independent communities into a profitable colonial enterprise. From the beginning, the IBAC faced problems that would have challenged a much larger and better funded organisation trying to administer a territory larger than Britain itself, with a handful of officials and whatever local allies they could recruit. The company's problems multiplied when they attempted to extend their authority inland. In 1890, Captain Frederick Lugard signed a treaty with the Kingdom of Buganda in what is now Uganda, but maintaining this relationship required substantial military and financial resources that the company simply didn't possess. Local resistance to company rule was frequent and sometimes highly effective. Wayaki Wahinga, a Kikuyu leader who had initially signed a treaty with Lugard, became so frustrated with harassment and broken promises that he burned down Lugard's fort in 1890. 2 years later, he was abducted by company officials and died in custody. By 1893, it was clear that the Imperial British East Africa Company was failing as both a business and a governing authority. The costs of administration far exceeded any profits from trade, and the company lacked the resources to maintain effective control over its claimed territory. On July 1st, 1895, the British government proclaimed the East Africa Protectorate, effectively taking over from the bankrupt IBAC and establishing direct imperial control under Sir Arthur Hardinge as the first commissioner. The new protectorate government faced the same fundamental challenge: how to make East Africa profitable enough to justify the costs of administration. The solution they developed would transform Kenya's landscape forever. The British decided that the key to success lay in building a railway from the coast to Lake Victoria, both to facilitate administration of Uganda and to open up the interior for economic development. This decision would trigger one of the most ambitious and controversial infrastructure projects in African history. The Uganda Railway was approved by Parliament in 1896 after considerable debate. Critics questioned both the enormous cost, estimated at £5 million, and the practical purpose of building a railway through largely empty wilderness. British politician Henry Labouchere famously mocked the project in verse, concluding that it was clearly naught but a lunatic line. The nickname lunatic line stuck, capturing both the ambition and the apparent absurdity of the project. Construction began at Mombasa in May 1896 under Chief Engineer George Whitehouse. The scale was staggering: over 580 miles of track through territory ranging from coastal swamps to highland plateaus. Recognizing that the sparsely populated interior couldn't provide enough labourers, the British recruited approximately 32,000 workers from British India, primarily from the Punjab region. These coolies signed 3-year contracts promising wages of 15 rupees per month, plus free rations and basic accommodation. What the contracts didn't adequately convey was the brutal difficulty of the work. The railway had to be built by hand across some of the most challenging terrain in Africa. Workers faced extreme heat, cold nights, diseases like malaria and dysentery, and wildlife that posed additional dangers no amount of planning could have anticipated. The most famous threat came from 2 maneless male lions near the Savo River, who systematically hunted railway workers for 9 months, killing at least 28 people according to official accounts, though some estimates put the number much higher. Despite these challenges, the railway progressed steadily inland, reaching what would become Nairobi in 1899. The site was chosen as a supply depot due to its elevation, which provided relief from coastal heat and fewer disease-carrying mosquitoes. The Maasai called the area Enkare Nairobi, meaning cold water. What started as railway tents and storage sheds would eventually grow into Kenya's capital city, though in 1899 it was little more than a swampy depot in uninhabitable wetland. The human cost was enormous. By the time the line reached Kisumu on Lake Victoria in 1901, approximately 2,500 workers had died, roughly 4 deaths for every mile of track laid. For the British colonial administration, these deaths were an acceptable cost of imperial development. The railway's completion marked the beginning of a new phase in Kenya's colonial transformation, but the enormous construction costs needed to be recovered through increased economic activity. The British colonial government decided that the most promising approach was to encourage European settlement in the fertile highlands along the railway route. Beginning in 1902, they actively recruited European settlers, offering them long-term leases on large tracts of land at favourable terms. The most desirable areas, the fertile, well-watered highlands with temperate climates, were designated as the White Highlands and reserved exclusively for European ownership and occupation. The creation of the White Highlands required the systematic appropriation of African land on an unprecedented scale. The Crown Lands Ordinance of 1902 declared all unoccupied land to be Crown property, but the definition of unoccupied was conveniently flexible, often excluding African communities who used land seasonally for grazing or had been temporarily displaced by famines and epidemics. Entire communities found themselves classified as squatters on land they had inhabited for generations. The Kikuyu people, whose traditional territory included some of the most fertile highland areas, suffered particularly severe losses. Their agricultural system, which combined cultivation with livestock keeping and involved seasonal movement between different areas, was incomprehensible to British officials accustomed to individual land ownership. Much of what the Kikuyu considered temporarily unused land was seized and granted to European settlers, forcing communities onto increasingly overcrowded reserves with poor soil and inadequate water. European settlers flocked to the White Highlands, drawn by cheap land, favourable climate and potential profits from cash crops. Lord Delamere established a large estate and became a powerful advocate for settler interests. By 1920, approximately 15,000 white settlers controlled over 7 million acres of Kenya's most fertile land. They developed Kenya into a significant exporter of coffee, tea, sisal, and other cash crops, with coffee proving particularly profitable in the volcanic soils and temperate climate of the Central Highlands. Tea cultivation expanded dramatically after 1925, when companies like Brook Bond established large estates in areas like Kericho and Limuru. These European farms became highly profitable enterprises, but their success was built entirely on the exploitation of African labour and the appropriation of African land. The settlers created a lifestyle that mimicked English country living, complete with polo clubs, golf courses, and elaborate social events, while the displaced African populations struggled to survive on marginal land in overcrowded reserves. This agricultural success depended entirely on cheap African labour, which the colonial government secured through an elaborate system of coercion and control. African communities displaced from their land and confined to overcrowded reserves were forced to seek wage employment on European farms to survive. The colonial government reinforced this dependency through taxation policies that required Africans to earn cash wages to pay their hut and poll taxes. The hut tax, introduced in 1901, required each African household to pay 2 rupees annually, while the poll tax of 1910 added another 3 rupees per adult male. These taxes had to be paid in cash, forcing people into the colonial wage economy whether they wanted to participate or not. The reserves where Africans were confined were deliberately kept underdeveloped, with no investment in roads, schools or medical facilities, ensuring that people had little choice but to seek work on European farms. This system created a captive labour force that could be paid minimal wages because workers had no viable alternatives. The Kipand system, introduced in 1915 and expanded in 1920, became the most visible and hated symbol of colonial control. All African men over 16 were required to carry a metal passbook containing their personal details, employment history, tax payments, and current work permit. The kipand had to be carried at all times and produced on demand. Failure to carry it could result in fines, imprisonment, or forced labour. Africans nicknamed the kipand Mbugi, a goat's bell, because it marked them as part of a controlled flock rather than free individuals. The system effectively tied African workers to their employers, making it difficult to change jobs, negotiate better wages, or return to their home areas without permission. It also created a detailed surveillance network that allowed colonial authorities to track and control African movement throughout the colony. The colonial government also prohibited Africans from growing the most profitable cash crops, particularly coffee, supposedly to maintain quality standards but actually to prevent competition with European settlers. This economic exclusion was enforced through licensing systems that were virtually impossible for Africans to navigate, marketing boards that controlled crop sales, and direct prohibition backed by criminal penalties. Meanwhile, the Indian community that originated with railway construction workers established itself as a middle tier in Kenya's racial hierarchy. About 6,700 Indian workers stayed after the railway's completion, establishing businesses or finding skilled employment. By 1921, Kenya's Indian population had grown to over 22,000, outnumbering the European settler population. This created a 3-tier racial system: European at the top, Indian in the middle, African at the bottom. By 1920, when the East Africa Protectorate became the colony and protectorate of Kenya, the basic structures of colonial rule were firmly established. The colonial government had successfully created an economy based on European settler agriculture supported by African labour, connected to global markets by the Uganda Railway, and controlled through an elaborate system of racial segregation and administrative coercion. In less than 25 years, Kenya had been transformed from a collection of independent communities into a racially stratified colonial society organised around the extraction of wealth for the benefit of a small European minority. The colonial period also marked the beginning of sustained African political resistance. The Young Kikuyu Association, formed in 1921 by Harry Thuku, began organising protests against taxation, land seizures, and the kipand system. Though Thuku was arrested for his activities, his organisation represented the emergence of modern African nationalism in Kenya. Throughout this period, Africans adapted, resisted, and found ways to survive within colonial constraints while maintaining their dignity and cultural identity, gradually building the foundations for the independence movement that would eventually reclaim their country. Chapter 4: Independence, Struggle, and Modern Kenya. By the 1940s, the colonial system in Kenya had reached a kind of malevolent perfection. The machinery of control was running smoothly. The racial hierarchies were legally enshrined, and the economic extraction was generating handsome profits for European settlers and the British Empire. What the colonial authorities had not anticipated was that this very efficiency would eventually become the source of their downfall, because nothing motivates resistance quite like a really well-organized injustice. The roots of the independence struggle can be traced back to the return of African veterans from World War II. Tens of thousands of Kenyans had served in the British Army, particularly in the Southeast Asian theatre, where they had witnessed European soldiers being defeated by Asian forces and absorbed ideas about self-determination and nationalism. These veterans returned home expecting to be rewarded for their loyal service, only to find that racist policies remained unchanged and political representation was still denied. It was like finishing a group project where you did most of the work only to discover that your partners are planning to take all the credit. The irony was particularly bitter given that these same men had risked their lives fighting fascism abroad, only to return to a system that denied them basic human rights at home. In 1944, the Kenya African Union was formed to represent African political interests across ethnic lines. In 1947, the organisation elected Jomo Kenyatta as its president, bringing to the leadership a man who had spent 15 years in Britain studying and advocating for Kenyan interests. Under Kenyatta's leadership, the KU campaigned for African representation in government, the return of alienated land, and the abolition of the Kipand pass system. The organisation held mass rallies and submitted petitions to the colonial government, but these peaceful efforts achieved virtually nothing. By 1950, a more militant faction had emerged within the broader nationalist movement. These activists, frustrated by the lack of progress through peaceful means, began organising secret oathing ceremonies based on traditional Kikuyu practices. The oaths bound participants to secrecy and committed them to the struggle for land and freedom, Ithaka na Wiathi in Kikuyu. The British called this movement Mau Mau, though the participants referred to themselves as the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. The movement combined traditional African spiritual practices with modern political objectives in ways that deeply unsettled the colonial authorities. What made the movement particularly threatening to colonial rule was its ability to unite people across class lines: educated clerks and labourers, small farmers and landless squatters, all bound together by shared grievances and traditional ceremonies that colonial authorities could neither understand nor effectively infiltrate. Tensions escalated throughout 1952 as incidents of violence increased. Mau Mau fighters attacked settler farms, government installations, and Africans who collaborated with the colonial regime. The British response was swift and brutal. On October 20th, 1952, Governor Evelyn Baring declared a state of emergency, launching Operation Jock Scott to arrest suspected Mau Mau leaders throughout the colony. Among those arrested was Jomo Kenyatta himself, despite his complex relationship with the militant wing and his public condemnation of Mau Mau violence. With the moderate leadership in detention, the armed struggle intensified dramatically. Thousands of Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru fighters took to the forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdare Mountains, establishing camps from which they could launch attacks on colonial targets. These forest fighters were joined by thousands more who had been evicted from settler farms where they had worked, sometimes for generations. The Mau Mau fighters developed sophisticated guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of local terrain and support from sympathetic communities. The British colonial response was one of the most brutal counterinsurgency campaigns in the history of decolonisation. They deployed over 20,000 troops and established a network of detention camps where suspected Mau Mau supporters were subjected to systematic torture and rehabilitation programs. Perhaps even more devastating was the policy of villagization, which forcibly relocated approximately 1.5 million Kikuyu civilians into fortified villages that were essentially concentration camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The human cost was enormous. By 1956, more than 11,000 Mau Mau fighters had been killed, along with about 100 Europeans and 2,000 African loyalists. However, these official figures significantly understate the total death toll, as tens of thousands of civilians died in the camps and fortified villages from disease, malnutrition and violence. The emergency created a legacy of trauma that would affect Kenyan society for generations, while also demonstrating that continued colonial rule would require levels of violence that were becoming unacceptable to international opinion. By the late 1950s, British policy began to shift toward finding a face-saving exit strategy. The Conservative government concluded that the costs of maintaining colonial control outweighed the benefits, particularly given the changing international climate. In 1959, the first African members were elected to Kenya's Legislative Council, marking the beginning of a gradual transition toward African majority rule. The Lancaster House Conference in London in 1960 negotiated constitutional arrangements for self-government. Two major African political parties emerged to contest the transition. The Kenya African National Union represented the interests of larger ethnic groups, particularly the Kikuyu and Luo, advocating for a unitary state with strong central government. The Kenya African Democratic Union represented smaller ethnic groups who feared domination and advocated for federalism. In August 1961, Jomo Kenyatta was finally released from detention after nearly 9 years in prison, emerging as a figure of reconciliation who advocated for peaceful transition to majority rule. The final elections before independence were held in May 1963, with KANU winning a decisive victory. Jomo Kenyatta became Prime Minister on June 1, 1963. On December 12, 1963, at midnight, the British Union Jack was lowered for the last time and replaced with the new Kenyan flag. Jomo Kenyatta became the first president, declaring Harambee, pulling together, as the national motto. The early years of independence were marked by achievements in education and healthcare, but also by growing authoritarianism. The promise of multi-party democracy proved short-lived. Political competition took on ethnic dimensions, and by 1969, opposition parties were banned, making Kenya a de facto one-party state under KANU's control. This transition from multi-party competition to one-party rule reflected the broader challenges facing many African states in the immediate post-independence period, where the institutions of democracy often proved fragile in the face of ethnic divisions and economic pressures. When Jomo Kenyatta died in August 1978, he was succeeded by Daniel Arap Moi, a Kalenjin from the Rift Valley who had been chosen partly because his minority ethnic background made him seem less threatening to the various power centres within KANU. Moi's rule became increasingly authoritarian throughout the 1980s, characterised by systematic human rights abuses, widespread corruption, and the use of ethnic divisions to maintain control. In 1982, constitutional amendments formally made Kenya a one-party state. The government employed detention without trial, torture, and extrajudicial killings to suppress opposition, while economic resources were diverted to benefit Moi's supporters. Political dissent was crushed through a combination of state violence and economic pressure, with critics finding themselves not only imprisoned but also excluded from government contracts, jobs, and other opportunities. It was like independence had arrived, but the colonial mentality had simply changed management, with African authoritarians replacing European colonizers but maintaining many of the same oppressive practices. By the late 1980s, pressure was building for political reform from domestic and international sources. Kenyan civil society, churches, and professional associations demanded greater freedoms. International donors, particularly after the Cold War reduced Kenya's strategic importance, began conditioning aid on reforms. The murder of Foreign Minister Robert Oko in 1990, widely attributed to government officials, sparked widespread protests and international criticism. The decisive moment came in 1991, when international donors suspended $350 million in aid, forcing Moi to accept multi-party democracy. However, the first multi-party elections in December 1992 saw Moi retain power with only 36% of the vote, because the opposition was divided among three major candidates. The 1997 elections produced similar results, with both elections marred by ethnic violence that appeared orchestrated by the government. The breakthrough came in 2002, when constitutional term limits prevented Moi from seeking re-election. Opposition leaders united behind Mwai Kibaki of the National Rainbow Coalition. Kibaki's famous endorsement by Raila Odinga, Kibaki Tosha, became a rallying cry that brought together diverse opposition groups. Kibaki won decisively with 62% of the vote, marking KANU's first electoral defeat since independence and the first peaceful transfer of power between parties. The victory celebration that followed was unlike anything Kenya had seen since independence, with millions of people taking to the streets in spontaneous demonstrations of joy that crossed ethnic and class lines. For a brief moment, it seemed that Kenya had finally achieved the democratic promise that had been deferred since independence. Kibaki's government implemented significant constitutional reforms, expanded free primary education, and presided over sustained economic growth. However, the coalition soon fractured over constitutional reform. The 2007 elections became the most severe test of Kenya's democracy. When Kibaki was declared winner in circumstances many considered fraudulent, Kenya erupted in post-election violence that killed over 1,500 people and displaced hundreds of thousands more. International mediation led by Kofi Annan eventually produced a power-sharing agreement that created the position of Prime Minister for Raila Odinga while Kibaki remained president. The Grand Coalition government, though dysfunctional, managed to oversee the drafting and passage of a new constitution in 2010 that devolved power to 47 county governments, strengthened checks and balances, and established an independent judiciary. Under the new constitution, Kenya held elections in 2013 that brought Uhuru Kenyatta to power in alliance with William Ruto. Ironically, both faced charges at the International Criminal Court related to the 2007 violence, but successfully framed their candidacy as rejection of foreign interference. Their victory demonstrated the continued importance of ethnic arithmetic, but also voter sophistication in distinguishing between international legal processes and domestic political competition. Today, Kenya stands as one of Africa's most vibrant democracies, with competitive elections, relatively free press, and active civil society. Significant challenges remain, including persistent corruption, ethnic tensions, and economic inequality. However, the country has successfully conducted multiple peaceful elections since 2013, with power changing hands between different coalitions. The devolution of power to county governments has created new opportunities for local democracy and development, while also introducing new forms of political competition. Kenya's economy has also diversified significantly from its colonial origins as a producer of agricultural commodities, emerging as a regional hub for technology, finance and services, though the benefits of this growth have not been equally shared across all segments of society. Kenya's journey from colony to modern democracy has been marked by setbacks and struggles, but also by remarkable resilience and the gradual strengthening of democratic institutions. The story of Kenya's independence struggle illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of political change in post-colonial Africa. The Mau Mau fighters who took to the forests could hardly have imagined their country would become a stable democracy with regular competitive elections. Yet their sacrifice, along with subsequent generations of Kenyan democrats, created the foundation for today's vibrant political system. From the constitutional conferences of the 1960s to the street demonstrations of the 1990s to the constitutional reform process of the 2000s, each generation has contributed to the slow but steady expansion of democratic space. Kenya's democracy remains imperfect, but represents a remarkable achievement for a country that spent its first decades under authoritarian rule. Chapter 5: Geography, Climate and Natural Wonders. If you were to design a country that showcased the maximum possible variety of African landscapes in a single territory, you would probably end up with something very much like Kenya. Positioned astride the equator on Africa's eastern coast, Kenya manages to pack an almost absurd amount of geographical diversity into its 580,000 square kilometres. From snow-capped mountains to coral reefs, from arid deserts to lush highland forests, from volcanic craters to pristine beaches, Kenya is essentially a geological greatest hits album that somehow got compressed into a single country. It's as if nature decided to show off and use Kenya as its portfolio. At the heart of Kenya's dramatic geography lies the Great Rift Valley, one of Earth's most spectacular geological features. This immense scar across the landscape stretches roughly 6,000 kilometers from Syria to Mozambique, but nowhere is it more spectacular than in Kenya. The Kenyan section of the Rift Valley was formed by the interaction of three massive tectonic plates, the Arabian, Nubian, and Somalian plates, which created what geologists call the Kenyan Dome. The resulting valley cuts dramatically through the country from north to south, creating a landscape of towering escarpments, volcanic peaks, and glittering lakes that seems almost too cinematic to be real. The Rift Valley divides Kenya's highland areas into two distinct regions, each with its own character and ecological treasures. To the east of the valley rise the spectacular peaks of Mount Kenya and the Aberdare Range, while to the west lie the equally impressive Mau Escarpment and Cherangani Hills. This division creates what geographers call the Kenya Highlands, a vast volcanic plateau that sits between 1,500 and 3,000 metres above sea level and enjoys a temperate climate that makes it one of the most pleasant and productive regions in tropical Africa. Mount Kenya itself deserves particular attention as both a geographical marvel and a national symbol. Rising to 5,199 metres at its highest point, Batian Peak, this ancient stratovolcano is Africa's second highest mountain after Kilimanjaro. What makes Mount Kenya particularly fascinating is that despite sitting almost directly on the equator, its upper reaches are permanently snow-capped, creating the surreal sight of glaciers and tropical vegetation existing within a few thousand metres of each other. The mountain has three main peaks, Batian, Nilion, and Point Lenana, surrounded by a series of dramatic peaks, alpine lakes, and unique high-altitude vegetation that exists nowhere else on Earth. Like an ancient cathedral reaching toward the heavens, Mount Kenya dominates the landscape for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The geological drama of the Rift Valley extends far beyond its mountains and escarpments to include a remarkable chain of lakes that reads like a catalogue of natural wonders. From north to south, these include Lake Turkana, Kenya's largest lake, and often called the Jade Sea for its distinctive blue-green waters, Lake Baringo, one of only two freshwater lakes in the Rift Valley. Lake Bogoria, famous for its hot springs and massive flocks of flamingos. Lake Nakuru, renowned worldwide for its pink flamingo displays. Lake Naivasha, the largest and highest of the Rift Valley lakes. And Lake Magadi, a soda lake so alkaline that it's essentially a natural chemical factory. Each lake has its own unique character, ecosystem, and collection of wildlife, creating a string of aquatic jewels across the valley floor. The volcanic heritage of the Rift Valley has created not just beautiful landscapes, but also some genuinely otherworldly places. Hell's Gate National Park, located south of Lake Naivasha, features dramatic gorges, towering cliffs, and geothermal springs that inspired Disney's animators when they were creating the landscape for The Lion King. The park's geothermal activity is so intense that it powers a significant portion of Kenya's electricity grid through the Olkaria geothermal plant. Meanwhile, Mount Longonot, a dormant stratovolcano that last erupted in the early 1900s, offers visitors the chance to hike around the rim of a perfect volcanic crater while enjoying panoramic views across the Rift Valley. Kenya's climate is as varied as its topography, creating a patchwork of different weather patterns that change dramatically over relatively short distances. The coastal region enjoys a tropical climate moderated by monsoon winds from the Indian Ocean, with temperatures typically ranging between 24 and 32 degrees Celsius and two distinct rainy seasons. The highlands, thanks to their elevation, have what can only be described as perfect weather, temperate, spring-like conditions with average temperatures between 15 and 25 degrees Celsius that make Scottish summers look tropical and Mediterranean winters seem harsh by comparison. The northern and eastern regions of Kenya present an entirely different climatic reality, dominated by arid and semi-arid conditions that create some of Africa's most challenging but starkly beautiful landscapes. Here, annual rainfall can be as low as 250 millimeters, creating genuine desert conditions in places like the Chalbi Desert and vast semi-arid plains that stretch towards Somalia and Ethiopia. These areas might seem inhospitable, but they support remarkable ecosystems adapted to harsh conditions, including unique wildlife species found nowhere else in Kenya. Kenya's wildlife heritage is legendary, and the country's national parks and reserves protect some of the most spectacular animal populations on Earth. The Masai Mara National Reserve, perhaps Kenya's most famous protected area, hosts the annual Great Migration, one of the planet's most extraordinary wildlife spectacles. Every year between July and October, over 1.3 million wildebeest, accompanied by hundreds of thousands of zebras and gazelles, pour across the Mara River from Tanzania's Serengeti in search of fresh grazing. The dramatic river crossings, with animals facing swift currents and waiting crocodiles, provide some of the most compelling wildlife viewing opportunities anywhere in the world. Amboseli National Park offers a completely different but equally magnificent wildlife experience. Situated at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro, with elephants often silhouetted against the snow-capped mountain in scenes that seem almost too perfect to be natural. The park is famous for its large elephant herds, but it also supports lions, cheetahs, buffalo, and over 400 bird species in an ecosystem that demonstrates the remarkable diversity possible within relatively small areas of African savanna. The massive Tsavo East and Tsavo West National Parks together cover over 21,000 square kilometres, making them Kenya's largest protected area and one of the largest wilderness areas in the world. Tsavo East is famous for its red elephants, not a separate species, but animals that coat themselves in the area's distinctive red dust. while Tsavo West features dramatic landscapes including lava flows, mountain springs, and the famous Mzima Springs where hippos and crocodiles can be observed underwater through viewing chambers. The parks represent wilderness on a truly African scale, where wildlife roams across landscapes that stretch beyond the horizon. Lake Nakuru National Park, though much smaller than the Great Savannah Reserves, offers wildlife viewing opportunities that are no less spectacular. The lake itself periodically hosts millions of flamingos that turn its surface pink, creating one of the most photographed wildlife sites in Africa. The park also serves as a sanctuary for both black and white rhinoceros, and its acacia woodlands support substantial populations of buffalo, waterbuck, and the endangered Rothschild's giraffe. Kenya's Indian Ocean coastline adds yet another dimension to the country's natural wealth. The coast stretches for roughly 536 kilometers from Somalia in the north to Tanzania in the south, featuring pristine white sand beaches backed by coconut palms, ancient coral reefs teeming with marine life, and a series of protected areas that safeguard some of the Western Indian Ocean's most important ecosystems. The coastal region is characterized by fringing coral reefs that protect the shore from ocean swells, while creating ideal conditions for an extraordinary diversity of marine life. Kenya's marine national parks represent some of the oldest marine protected areas in the world, with Watamu Marine National Park established in 1968. These parks protect over 600 square kilometers of critical marine ecosystems, including coral reefs, seagrass beds, and mangrove forests that serve as nurseries for hundreds of fish species. The best reef development is found in the southern part of the coast at Diani Chale and Kisite Mpunguti, where pristine coral gardens support an incredible diversity of marine life, including over 250 coral species. The marine ecosystems along Kenya's coast support remarkable megafauna, including dolphins, whales, dugongs, and sea turtles. 4 species of sea turtles nest on Kenyan beaches, including the endangered green turtle and hawksbill turtle, while dugongs, gentle marine mammals related to elephants, graze in seagrass beds from Malindi to Kisite. The seasonal arrival of humpback whales between August and November adds yet another spectacular wildlife viewing opportunity to Kenya's coastal waters. Perhaps most remarkable of all is how these diverse ecosystems support each other through complex ecological connections. The highland forests of Mount Kenya, the Aberdares, and the Mau complex serve as crucial water towers that capture moisture from the atmosphere and feed the rivers that sustain both human communities and wildlife throughout the country. The Tana River, Kenya's longest, originates in these highland forests and flows over 1,000 kilometers to the coast, supporting agriculture, generating hydroelectric power, and maintaining the river mouth ecosystems that are crucial for marine productivity. The volcanic soils created by the Rift Valley's geological activity have produced some of the most fertile agricultural land in Africa, supporting the tea and coffee plantations that have become synonymous with Kenyan agriculture. These highland agricultural areas exist in harmony with forest reserves that protect watershed areas and provide habitat for unique species like the mountain bongo antelope and Sykes's monkey. It's a landscape where human development and natural ecosystems have found ways to coexist, though not without ongoing challenges. Climate change is already affecting Kenya's natural systems in measurable ways. Mount Kenya's glaciers are retreating rapidly and may disappear entirely within decades, while coral reefs have experienced several severe bleaching events, including a devastating episode in 1998 that killed 50 to 90% of corals in some areas. However, Kenya has also become a leader in climate adaptation and renewable energy, with the geothermal potential of the Rift Valley providing an estimated 50 gigawatts of untapped clean energy. The seasonal patterns that govern Kenya's climate and wildlife create a country that reinvents itself throughout the year. The long rains from March to May transform the landscape from brown to green almost overnight, triggering the breeding seasons for many animals and the spectacular wildflower displays that carpet the grasslands. The dry season from June to October offers the best wildlife viewing as animals concentrate around water sources, but also creates the dramatic skies and clear atmospheric conditions that make the country's mountains and escarpments visible from enormous distances. Kenya's geography represents a masterpiece of natural architecture, where every element, from the snow-capped peaks to the coral reefs, from the volcanic lakes to the acacia savannas, contributes to a landscape that seems almost designed for maximum visual impact. Standing on the rim of the Rift Valley at sunset, watching elephants move across the plains with Mount Kenya rising in the distance, or snorkeling over pristine coral reefs while dolphins play nearby, it becomes clear why Kenya has captured the imagination of travellers, scientists and conservationists for over a century. This extraordinary geographical diversity is not just beautiful but also scientifically invaluable. Kenya's position at the intersection of different biogeographical regions, combined with its altitude gradients and climatic variety, has made it a natural laboratory for understanding evolution, ecology, and conservation. From the fossil sites of Lake Turkana that reveal human origins to the coral reefs that demonstrate marine ecosystem dynamics, Kenya's natural heritage provides insights into both our past and our planet's future. It is quite literally one of the most remarkable countries on Earth, where the full majesty of African landscapes is displayed in a single, spectacular package. Chapter 6: Culture, Economy and Contemporary Kenya. In the bustling streets of Nairobi, you might encounter a Maasai warrior in traditional red shuka talking on a smartphone while sipping a latte, a Kikuyu businesswoman closing deals in 3 different languages, and young tech entrepreneurs from across Africa coding the next breakthrough app. This is modern Kenya, a country that has somehow managed to embrace the future while honouring the past, creating a unique cultural synthesis that defies easy categorization. If Kenya's history is a story of transformation, then its contemporary culture is the living, breathing embodiment of that change, where ancient traditions dance with cutting-edge technology in ways that would seem impossible anywhere else. Kenya's cultural diversity is staggering even by African standards, with over 40 officially recognized ethnic groups, each contributing their own languages, traditions and worldviews. The country represents a microcosm of African civilization. The largest group, the Kikuyu, makes up about 17% of the population and predominantly inhabit the fertile central highlands around Mount Kenya. Historically agricultural, the Kikuyu have also become Kenya's most urbanized and economically influential community, playing central roles in business, politics, and education while maintaining strong connections to their ancestral lands and traditions. The Luhya, Kenya's second largest ethnic group at 14% of the population, primarily inhabit Western Kenya and consist of 18 distinct sub-tribes, each with its own dialect and customs. Known for their agricultural expertise and warm hospitality, the Luhya have contributed significantly to Kenya's food security and cultural life. Meanwhile, the Luo people, representing about 11% of the population, have earned a reputation for their eloquence, educational achievements, and strong cultural pride. Living around Lake Victoria, the Luo have traditionally been fishermen and farmers, but have also produced many of Kenya's most prominent politicians, academics, and artists. The Kalenjin, primarily inhabiting the Rift Valley, have become world famous for producing some of the planet's greatest long-distance runners, a phenomenon that has fascinated scientists and sports enthusiasts for decades. Living at high altitude and traditionally pastoral, the Kalenjin have dominated international marathons and middle-distance running to an extent that seems almost supernatural. It's not uncommon for a small Kalenjin village to produce more world-class marathon runners than entire continents, turning the act of running into a kind of cultural export that has put Kenya on the global sports map. Perhaps no group better exemplifies the tension between tradition and modernity than the Maasai, who have become almost synonymous with East African culture despite representing only about 2% of Kenya's population. The Maasai have managed to maintain many of their traditional practices, from cattle herding and age-set ceremonies to distinctive dress and social structures, while adapting to contemporary realities. Today's Maasai might use GPS to track their cattle, send money via mobile banking, and attend university, all while participating in ancient ceremonies and maintaining their cultural identity. It's a balancing act that serves as a metaphor for Kenya's broader cultural evolution. The linguistic landscape of Kenya reflects this cultural diversity, with English and Swahili serving as official languages, while dozens of indigenous languages continue to thrive. Swahili, originally a coastal trading language that blended Arabic, Bantu, and other influences, has become a unifying force that allows Kenyans from different ethnic backgrounds to communicate easily. But perhaps most interesting is the emergence of Sheng, a dynamic urban language that mixes Swahili, English, and various indigenous languages to create a constantly evolving street vernacular that captures the creativity and adaptability of Kenya's youth. Kenya's economic transformation has been equally dramatic. From a colonial economy based on agricultural exports and resource extraction, Kenya has evolved into East Africa's largest and most diversified economy, contributing roughly half of the region's total GDP. Agriculture remains crucial, employing about 40% of the workforce and contributing around 25% of GDP. But the economy has diversified into manufacturing, services, and technology in ways that have positioned Kenya as a regional leader. The agricultural sector itself tells a story of adaptation and innovation. Kenya remains one of the world's leading exporters of tea and coffee, crops introduced during the colonial period, but now deeply embedded in the country's economic and cultural identity. The tea plantations of Kericho and the coffee farms of central Kenya produce some of the world's finest beverages, supporting hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers. But Kenyan agriculture has also diversified dramatically, with the country becoming a major exporter of cut flowers, vegetables, and exotic fruits to Europe and other international markets. The sight of roses grown on the shores of Lake Naivasha being airlifted to London florists the next day captures both the efficiency and the global connectivity of modern Kenyan agriculture. However, it's in the technology sector that Kenya has truly surprised the world. Nairobi has earned the nickname Silicon Savannah for its thriving tech ecosystem, anchored by innovations like M-Pesa, the mobile money transfer service that revolutionized financial inclusion not just in Kenya but across Africa. Launched in 2007 by telecommunications company Safaricom, M-Pesa transformed simple mobile phones into secure bank accounts, allowing millions of Kenyans to participate in the formal economy for the first time. Today, M-Pesa processes billions of dollars in transactions annually and has become a model for mobile banking systems worldwide. The success of M-Pesa exemplifies Kenya's approach to technological innovation, identifying uniquely African problems and developing uniquely African solutions. Rather than simply importing Western technologies, Kenyan entrepreneurs have created systems designed for local conditions, from intermittent electricity and limited internet connectivity to large unbanked populations and challenging geography. This has led to innovations like BRCK, which provides internet connectivity in remote areas, and iCow, which offers dairy farming advice via SMS to smallholder farmers who might not have access to extension services. Kenya's tech sector has attracted attention from global giants, with companies like Microsoft, IBM, and Google establishing major operations in Nairobi. Microsoft's Africa Development Center, a $100 million investment, represents the largest software development center Microsoft has built in Africa. These investments reflect Kenya's growing reputation as a tech hub that can serve not just the local market but the entire continent. The planned Konza Technopolis, often called Kenya's Silicon Valley, represents a $14 billion investment in creating a world-class technology city that could rival Singapore or Tel Aviv. The financial services sector has been particularly transformed by technology. Kenya's mobile phone penetration rate of over 90% has enabled innovations that have made the country a global leader in fintech. Beyond M-Pesa, dozens of digital lending platforms, savings apps, and investment services have emerged, creating an ecosystem where farmers can access credit via their phones, and small business owners can build credit histories through mobile transactions. This financial inclusion has had profound effects on economic development, enabling millions of Kenyans to start businesses, save money, and invest in their futures in ways that would have been impossible just 2 decades ago. Tourism remains one of Kenya's most important industries, contributing around 10% of GDP and providing livelihoods for millions of Kenyans. But even tourism has evolved beyond the traditional safari model to include cultural tourism, ecotourism, and conference tourism that leverages Kenya's position as East Africa's business hub. The country hosts hundreds of international conferences annually, while initiatives like community conservancies have created models where local communities benefit directly from wildlife conservation, aligning economic incentives with environmental protection. Manufacturing, while still a relatively small sector, has been targeted for major expansion under Kenya's Vision 2030 development plan. The government aims to increase manufacturing's contribution to GDP from the current 10% to 15% by creating special economic zones, improving infrastructure, and developing value-added processing of agricultural products. Initiatives like the African Growth and Opportunity Act have provided duty-free access to US markets for Kenyan textiles, while the African Continental Free Trade Area promises to create a continental market of over 1 billion people. Infrastructure development has been central to Kenya's economic transformation. The standard gauge railway connecting Nairobi to the port of Mombasa has reduced cargo transport times and costs dramatically, while massive investments in geothermal energy have made Kenya a leader in renewable electricity generation. The country now produces over 90% of its electricity from renewable sources, primarily geothermal, hydroelectric, and wind power. This clean energy advantage has attracted energy-intensive industries and positioned Kenya as a potential hub for green manufacturing. Contemporary Kenyan society reflects all these economic and technological changes while grappling with the challenges they bring. Urbanization has accelerated dramatically, with cities like Nairobi experiencing both exciting growth and significant challenges. The emergence of a substantial middle class has created new consumption patterns, educational aspirations, and lifestyle choices that are reshaping Kenyan society. Shopping malls, international restaurants, and modern housing developments coexist with traditional markets and older neighborhoods, creating urban landscapes that capture the country's ongoing transformation. Education has become a national obsession, with Kenya boasting one of Africa's highest literacy rates and a robust higher education system. The introduction of free primary education and massive investments in technical and vocational training have created a young, educated population that provides the human capital for Kenya's economic ambitions. Universities like the University of Nairobi, Kenyatta University, and newer institutions have become regional centres of excellence, attracting students from across East Africa. Yet challenges remain significant. Income inequality has grown alongside economic development, with wealth concentrated in urban areas, while many rural communities still lack basic services. Youth unemployment remains high despite economic growth, creating social tensions and driving rural-urban migration that strains city services. Climate change poses increasing threats to agricultural productivity, while rapid urbanization has created infrastructure deficits that governments struggle to address. Political development has been equally complex. Kenya's transition to multi-party democracy in the 1990s has created a vibrant but sometimes turbulent political system where ethnicity still plays a significant role in electoral politics. The adoption of a new constitution in 2010, which devolved significant powers to 47 county governments, has created new opportunities for local development, while also generating new forms of political competition. The peaceful transfer of power in recent elections suggests that democratic institutions are strengthening, though challenges around corruption, accountability, and ethnic polarization persist. Kenya's soft power influence extends far beyond its borders. Kenyan music, particularly genres like Afro beats and gospel, enjoys popularity throughout East Africa and beyond. Kenyan athletes dominate international running competitions to an extent that has made the country synonymous with distance running excellence. Kenyan writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o have achieved international recognition, while Kenyan films and television programs find audiences throughout Africa. The country's diplomatic influence as a mediator in regional conflicts and its role in continental organizations like the African Union reflect its growing regional leadership. Looking toward the future, Kenya faces both tremendous opportunities and significant challenges. The country's young, educated, and increasingly connected population provides enormous potential for continued growth and innovation. The tech sector's success has created a foundation for expanding into artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and other emerging fields. Massive infrastructure investments are beginning to pay dividends in terms of reduced business costs and improved connectivity. Climate change represents perhaps the greatest long-term challenge, requiring adaptations in agriculture, water management, and urban planning. The country's leadership in renewable energy provides a foundation for climate resilience, but will require continued innovation and investment. Managing rapid urbanization while preserving environmental resources and cultural heritage will test Kenya's planning capabilities and political systems. What makes Kenya remarkable is not just its economic progress or technological innovations, but its ability to remain recognizably Kenyan while embracing change. Traditional ceremonies continue alongside modern celebrations. Indigenous languages thrive alongside global ones, and ancient wisdom informs contemporary solutions. Kenya has managed to modernize without losing its soul, creating a society that honors its ancestors while building for its children. In a world where globalization often seems to homogenize cultures, Kenya offers a different model, one where diversity is strength, tradition is a resource for innovation, and the future is built on the foundation of the past. This is Kenya today, a country where cutting-edge technology serves age-old needs, where traditional cultures adapt rather than disappear, and where the future is being written by people who remember their history. It's a place where the ancient and the ultra-modern coexist in ways that seem impossible until you witness them, creating a unique civilization that offers lessons for the world about how to change while remaining true to yourself. Kenya's story is far from over. If anything, the most interesting chapters may just be beginning.